The wooden mallet strikes, and the lid of the barrel bursts apart in a spray of splinters. Steam curls upward as the crowd cheers, the fragrance of warm rice drifting into the frozen night. It is a scene repeated across Japan for centuries, the ritual known as Kagami Biraki, the opening of the mirror. To outsiders, it looks like nothing more than a party, but to those gathered, it is an offering to the gods, a blessing for the community, and a reminder that sake is far more than a drink. Ladles plunge into the barrel, filling wooden cups as hands reach forward from every direction. Farmers, merchants, priests, even samurai once stood shoulder to shoulder for this moment, their rank dissolved in the steam of shared sake. The liquid glows pale in the torchlight, carried from mouth to mouth like a binding oath. To drink was to join, to hesitate was to remain apart. Sake's burn is deceptively gentle. It is softer than whiskey, smoother than wine, yet its strength creeps quickly, flooding the chest with heat before the mind realizes it has surrendered. In villages and cities alike, it became the heartbeat of celebration. Weddings, harvests, battles, won or lost, all were sealed with the tilt of a cup. What began as a sacred offering to the gods spilled into taverns, tear rooms, and family tables, blurring the line between ritual and indulgence. The festival drums pound harder, flutes slicing through the air, but the sound carries a shadow. For every chant of blessing, there were whispers of excess. For every wedding toast, there was a warning sermon. Sake united Japan in its cups, yet it also divided it, becoming both a bridge of fellowship and a burden of addiction. The crowd drinks, laughing as steam clouds the square, but history has taught that every cup carries two faces. To some, it was warmth against the winter. To others, it was a slow-burning chain. And that is where the story begins. Long before barrels cracked open at winter festivals, sake began quietly in the hands of priests and healers. In the mist-shrouded valleys of early Japan, rice was not just food but a vessel of power, and fermentation was seen as a kind of alchemy. Records from the Nara period, in the 8th century, describe how rice, water, and mold were transformed into cloudy brews, used less for pleasure than for medicine. It was said to warm the body, ease the stomach, and purify the spirit. The earliest versions were crude by modern standards. One was called kuchikami no sake, literally mouth-chewed sake. Young maidens would chew handfuls of rice, their saliva rich with enzymes that broke down starches into sugar. The mixture was spat into vessels and left to ferment, producing a drink that was as sacred as it was unsettling to outsiders. The act was not only practical but spiritual, a ritual of breath and body binding people to the rice that sustained them. As brewing knowledge deepened, sake became less about survival and more about ceremony. By the Heian period in the 9th and 10th centuries, imperial courts oversaw production with strict rules. The Bureau of Sake, an official arm of the government, ensured that the drink was fit for rituals and banquets. No wedding, enthronement, or harvest festival was complete without it. Cups were lifted in sequence, often 3 at a time, symbolizing harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. To refuse a cup was more than impolite. It was a rejection of the order-binding society. Shrines across the country brewed their own versions. Offerings of sake were poured to the kami, the divine spirits believed to dwell in rivers, mountains, and harvests. In return, people prayed for good crops, healthy children, and protection against disaster. The liquid was thought to carry not just rice and water, but the favor of the gods themselves. Drinking it was less an indulgence than an act of communion, blurring the line between sacred and profane. Yet even then, the tension was clear. Priests praised sake as divine, but farmers also discovered its earthly comfort. A ladle of warm brew after a day in the fields dulled aching muscles and softened the edge of hunger. The same liquid poured onto a shrine altar could be passed around a hearth. From its earliest days, sake carried two faces, one turned toward heaven, the other toward the weary human hand. What began as medicine and ritual was already showing signs of something larger. The drink was leaving the shrine and entering the village, carried by both blessing and thirst. In the world of Shinto, no barrier stands between the sacred and the everyday. A river is not only water but the dwelling place of a spirit. A mountain is not only stone but a god's domain. And a cup of sake is not merely fermented rice, it is an offering, a bond, a passage between the human and the divine. At shrines across Japan, the ritual of omiki marked this connection. Priests in white robes would lift shallow cups of sake toward the altar, the liquid gleaming under the flicker of lantern light. Drops were poured onto the earth, a gift to the gods, before the rest was shared among the people. In this act, every sip became part of a covenant. To drink was to join in communion, to let the spirit of the rice move through the body as blessing. Weddings, too, carried sake at their heart. The ancient custom of sankudo, meaning 339 times, required a bride and groom to sip from 3 cups in 3 rounds, each drink sealing a different vow. The first was respect for the union. The second was a promise to family. The third was a pledge to the future. By the end, the couple was not only married to each other, but woven into the lineage of ancestors and descendants. The flavor of rice and water carried the weight of eternity. In village life, the communal aspect of sake was just as powerful. Festivals called for the breaking open of barrels in Kagami Biraki, the opening of the mirror, where lids were struck with wooden mallets and the drink ladled freely to all. The symbolism was clear. Just as the cracked lid revealed the liquid inside, the community revealed its unity in shared cups. Farmers, fishermen, merchants, and nobles crowded together, their differences dissolved in the same cloudy warmth. Yet, even in its sanctity, sake revealed the hierarchy of Japan. The emperor and his court drank refined brews, filtered and perfumed, while villagers sipped rougher versions brewed in barns. The same rituals echoed across classes, but the quality of what filled the cup often reflected status. Even so, the act of sharing was universal. To pour for another, to accept without refusal, was to show trust and humility. To neglect the custom was to insult not only the person but the spirits watching. Everywhere, sake blurred the line between ritual and indulgence. It was at once holy and ordinary, both altar and tavern. The cup in a priest's hand was not so different from the cup in a farmer's. And that duality gave sake its enduring power. It was more than drink, it was belonging. By the medieval centuries, sake had travelled far from the quiet altars of Shinto shrines. It spilled into homes, taverns, and military camps, becoming as much a part of daily survival as of sacred ritual. Farmers brewed it in small batches, often rough and cloudy, their methods handed down by memory rather than by record. After long days of bending over rice paddies, they warmed their hands on crude clay cups, the liquid sharp enough to numb aching muscles. For peasants, sake was not ceremony but relief, a simple comfort at the end of labor. The samurai, however, raised the same drink to very different ends. To them, sake was not merely warmth against the cold. It was a tool of loyalty, an emblem of honor. Before battle, warlords poured sake into shallow cups, passing them across ranks as men swore allegiance. To drink was to bind one's fate to one's commander, just as surely as any signed oath. Victories were toasted in the same way, with barrels cracked open in celebration, the steam of the drink mixing with the smell of blood and mud still clinging to armor. Ceremonial drinking also marked the founding of alliances. When rival clans sought peace, sake was poured in formal gatherings, each sip representing trust, reluctantly extended. A bitter swallow could carry the weight of life and death, for refusal was tantamount to insult. In this way, sake became a silent negotiator, bridging the distance between blades with a ritual of cups. The contrast between classes was stark. A samurai lord might order sake brewed with polished rice and careful techniques, producing a clear, refined liquor served in lacquered vessels. Meanwhile, the farmer's brew remained rustic, often sour, strained through cloth and shared in wooden ladles. Yet both were called sake, and both carried the same dual nature: sustenance and symbol, body and spirit. Travelers' accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe roadside taverns where peasants and warriors might sit within the same smoky walls, though never as equals. Farmers huddled in corners, drinking to silence their weariness. Samurai occupied the center, their cups refilled first, their laughter louder. Even so, the same steam rose from every cup, the same burn slid down every throat. In Saké, a hint of equality flickered, though always fleeting. By this period, sake had proven itself capable of crossing boundaries. It was divine in shrines, humble in villages, and strategic in castles. It bound farmers to families, soldiers to lords, and lords to one another. No matter the class, the ritual of pouring and drinking had become essential, turning rice into liquid that carried both unity and division. The cup was never just a cup. It was a mirror of power. By the 17th century, sake had flowed into the glittering heart of Edo's entertainment districts, where the line between art and indulgence blurred beneath paper lanterns. The ukiyo, the floating world, thrived in tea houses and pleasure quarters, where geisha, courtesans, and actors moved through rooms perfumed with incense and laughter. Here, sake was not only poured but performed, each cup part of a ritualized theater of desire, wit, and elegance. Geisha poured sake with deliberate grace, tilting porcelain cups with sleeves that trailed like river water. The act was never rushed, for the pause before the pour carried as much meaning as the drink itself. To accept was to show trust, to pour in return was to show respect. Among patrons, the exchange became a game of subtle gestures, each refill an unspoken conversation. A misplaced glance, a delay in lifting the cup, could signal favor or rejection more clearly than words. In kabuki theaters, where actors played out stories of loyalty and betrayal, sake appeared on stage as a symbol of festivity or doom. A drunken stumble could be comic relief, while a solemn toast might foreshadow tragedy. The audience, cups in hand, mirrored the drama before them. Sake became a bridge between performance and reality, binding viewers to the stage through shared intoxication. Within the Yoshiwara district, the most famous of Edo's pleasure quarters, sake was inseparable from the art of conversation. Patrons seeking escape from rigid social rules found in these lantern-lit streets a world where laughter flowed as easily as drink. A merchant who bowed deeply in public could sit across from a courtesan here, his status momentarily transformed by the warmth of sake and the flattery it purchased. Yet beneath the laughter lingered the quiet reminder that every sip was bought, every cup measured in coin. The rituals of bonding extended beyond entertainment. Among samurai and merchants, the Sakazuki ceremony carried immense weight. Two men would exchange cups 3 times, sealing a pact of loyalty or brotherhood. In some cases, this bond was considered stronger than blood. Betrayal of such an oath was not merely dishonorable, it was unforgivable. The clink of ceramic in dim-lit rooms carried consequences that stretched far beyond the drunken night. Yet, indulgence had its critics. Moralists warned that the floating world drowned men in debt and distraction, with sake as its current. Satirical woodblock prints often depicted drunks stumbling through the streets, mocked as fools who wasted both wealth and dignity. Still, the pleasure quarters thrived, fed by the same drink priests once poured at shrines. By the height of the Edo period, sake had become more than a beverage. It was an instrument of theatre, a test of etiquette, and a currency of intimacy. To sip in the floating world was to taste both elegance and illusion, sweetness edged with the bitterness of reality waiting outside the lantern's glow. Behind every cup raised in shrines, taverns, or pleasure quarters stood the unseen labor of brewers who transformed rice and water into liquid fire. Brewing sake was no simple task. It demanded patience, precision, and a trust in forces too small to see. At its heart was a humble mold, koji, sprinkled over steamed rice until a pale bloom spread like frost across each grain. Without it, fermentation would stall, for koji alone unlocked the starches hidden in rice, turning them into sugars that yeast could transform into alcohol. Breweries, or kura, became the beating hearts of towns during the coldest months of winter. In regions like Niigata, where snow muffled every sound and the air stayed sharp and clean, brewing thrived. Cold slowed the growth of unwanted bacteria, producing sake with a clarity and smoothness prized above all others. Guilds of brewers, called toji, migrated seasonally from villages to breweries, living together in tight quarters, their days marked by the rhythm of steaming, stirring, and waiting. The process was laborious. Rice had to be polished, often ground until half or more of each grain was removed, leaving behind the starchy core that brewed into delicate flavor. Too little polishing, and the drink turned rough and earthy. Too much, and only the wealthy could afford it. For each step added cost and time. Water, too, was critical. Some regions drew from mineral-rich springs, lending the drink a dry sharpness. Others relied on softer waters that produced gentler, rounder flavors. The debate over which water made superior sake divided connoisseurs then as it does today. Inside the breweries, the atmosphere carried both devotion and discipline. Workers rose before dawn to tend steaming vats, the air thick with the scent of rice and yeast. Wooden paddles churned the mash in silence, for brewers believed that loud voices could disrupt the fragile balance. At night, the men slept side by side on straw mats, their clothes reeking of fermentation, their dreams filled with the hiss of boiling water and the sweet-sour tang of alcohol rising from vats. Sake's strength varied with its method. Some brews reached nearly 20% alcohol, powerful enough to stun an unsteady drinker. Others were lighter, more delicate, sipped slowly in measured cups. By the early modern period, classification systems emerged, distinguishing ordinary sake from refined grades, yet the distinctions often reflected wealth more than taste. The farmer's cloudy brew might be dismissed as crude, but in its warmth lay the same comfort as the polished drink of a daimyo's banquet. Even as techniques advanced, the essence of brewing remained an act of balance. Rice, water, mold, and yeast, each with a voice, each demanding respect. Too much heat, and the brew soured. Too little time, and it dulled. The perfection of sake lay not in control, but in surrendering to the unseen dance of life inside the vat. And it was this quiet alchemy, hidden from the festival crowds, that ensured sake never vanished from Japan's table. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sake was no longer confined to shrines, castles, or lantern-lit tea-houses. It had become the drink of the people, flowing through villages, markets, and festivals with a familiarity as ordinary as rice itself. Street vendors balanced trays of shallow wooden cups, calling to passers-by. Travelers resting at roadside inns warmed their hands around steaming bowls. Farmers returned from the fields and merchants from their stalls, each ending the day with a swallow of the same cloudy liquor. Festivals were awash with sake. During the spring planting season and the autumn harvest, barrels were cracked open in town squares, their contents ladled freely among neighbors. A single sip could seal a bargain, calm an argument, or spark a chorus of song. In this way, sake functioned less as luxury than as glue, binding communities together. To drink was to participate, to stand apart was to refuse belonging. Yet sake also carried a shadow. Doctors in the late Edo period began warning of overindulgence, noting tremors, fevers, and sudden collapses among habitual drinkers. Satirists mocked men who staggered through alleyways, their debts forgotten until morning shame returned. Pamphlets circulated by moral reformers accused sake of draining wages and corroding families, a charge familiar in nearly every society where alcohol takes root. Still, the flow of the drink did not slow. For the working poor, sake was both solace and escape. A laborer could buy a small cup for a few coins, a cheap relief from hunger or fatigue. Housewives, often burdened by endless chores, found moments of laughter with neighbors over shared cups in narrow kitchens. Sailors, resting between voyages, toasted their safe return with bowls that burned away the salt still clinging to their throats. The drink blurred the boundaries of class, but it did not erase them. A daimyo's polished sake gleamed in porcelain cups, while a farmer's remained cloudy in wooden bowls. Still, both carried the same warmth sliding down the throat. In towns like Osaka and Edo, entire taverns grew around this communal culture. Their interiors were noisy, smoky, crowded, and alive with argument and song. Patrons leaned across low tables, pouring for each other in the ritual that demanded never to fill one's own cup. This act of humility reinforced the collective nature of drinking. To drink sake alone was unusual, even frowned upon. It was not a solitary indulgence, but a public bond. By this period, sake had become inseparable from identity. It was the taste of celebration and despair, of unity and of escape. For ordinary people, it was not history in the making, but daily bread in liquid form. And once woven into the fabric of common life, sake would never truly leave it. When Japan opened its ports in the middle of the 19th century, a tide of foreign influence swept across the islands. Steamships brought more than textiles and machinery. They carried new tastes, new customs, and new drinks. Beer, whiskey, and wine arrived with diplomats, traders, and soldiers, their flavors strange yet fashionable. In cities like Yokohama and Tokyo, Western-style bars appeared, their polished counters lined with bottles that gleamed amber and gold in the gaslight. At first, sake seemed immovable, too deeply rooted in ceremony and daily life to be threatened. But among the growing middle classes, foreign drinks carried the allure of modernity. Beer was crisp, refreshing, and marketed as hygienic, brewed in gleaming metal vats rather than wooden casks. Whiskey, dark and fiery, was embraced by men who admired its association with industrial might and sophistication. Wine, long admired in the West, arrived draped in the prestige of European refinement. Each bottle offered not just alcohol but status, a chance to participate in the new global order. Sake suddenly looked old-fashioned to some, tied to rituals and taverns that younger generations viewed as relics. Intellectuals debated its role. Was sake a proud expression of Japanese identity, or a stumbling block keeping the nation from modern progress? Newspapers of the Meiji era sometimes mocked it as rustic, unsuited to the ambitious future Japan sought to claim. Yet defenders argued the opposite. To abandon sake was to sever ties with centuries of history. To drink foreign liquor was to forget the taste of the ancestors. Breweries felt the pressure. Some sought to imitate Western styles, experimenting with beer or fortified wines. Others doubled down on tradition, polishing rice with greater precision, perfecting brewing methods to create refined grades that could compete with foreign imports. The industry split between innovation and preservation, mirroring the country's larger struggle to balance modernity with heritage. In Tokyo's Ginza district, Western bars drew the curious elite, while just a few streets away, traditional sake houses overflowed with workers who saw no reason to trade cloudy bowls for imported glass. The divide revealed a deeper tension, one not only about taste but about identity. To lift a whiskey glass in a Western suit was to proclaim oneself modern. To sip sake in a cotton kimono was to remain rooted. By the dawn of the 20th century, sake stood at a crossroads. It was no longer simply the nation's drink, but a symbol caught in the struggle between tradition and transformation. Every cup seemed to pose the same question Japan itself faced. Would the future be written in the burn of rice, or in the imported bite of barley and grape? The arrival of the 20th century brought upheaval that even sake could not escape. As Japan marched into wars abroad, rice was diverted from breweries to soldiers' rations. During the Second World War, shortages forced desperate compromises. Brewers were ordered to stretch what little rice they had with alcohol distilled from potatoes or sweet potatoes, then diluted with water and flavored with sugar. The result was thin, harsh, and far removed from the drink once offered at shrines. Families who had known the warmth of winter sake found only weak substitutes, their flavor a bitter reminder of scarcity. For many, this wartime brew tainted sake's reputation. Soldiers returned from the front with memories of rough cups swallowed more out of necessity than pleasure. Housewives who had once relied on it for festive meals found themselves serving beer instead, a drink more available as industrial production surged. After the war, as American influence reshaped Japan's economy and culture, whiskey and beer became the symbols of modern leisure, advertised on glowing billboards in Tokyo's neon-lit districts. Sake, meanwhile, was dismissed by some as old-fashioned, associated with poverty and the grim austerity of the war years. Its image faltered. Consumption declined as younger generations embraced the fizz of beer and the sharp burn of imported spirits. By the 1950s, newspapers worried openly that the national drink was losing its place. Yet decline was never the full story. In rural regions, traditional breweries clung to their craft. Master brewers, or toji, refused to abandon centuries-old methods, insisting that polished rice and winter air still produced something no foreign bottle could rival. Their persistence gave rise to a quiet renaissance. By focusing on quality rather than quantity, they began to produce premium sake, distinguished by categories such as junmai, ginjo, and daiginjo, each reflecting levels of refinement and devotion to craft. This reinvention was not immediate, but it planted seeds for the revival that would follow decades later. In the 1960s, festivals once again celebrated the cracking of barrels, and small breweries discovered that there was pride in staying traditional while the cities chased modernity. In this way, sake adapted without losing its essence. It became both a survivor of hardship and a symbol of resilience. By enduring scarcity and reinvention, sake proved what history had already shown. It was more than a drink. It was a mirror of Japan itself, able to bend under pressure but unwilling to break. By the late 20th century, sake had begun to shed the shadows of war and rediscover its brilliance. Small breweries, once overlooked, found new audiences among Japanese who longed for authenticity. Instead of mass-produced wartime substitutes, drinkers sought the delicate notes of premium junmai daiginjo, made from rice polished until only a fraction of each grain remained. Clear, fragrant, and refined, this was sake reborn as art. At the same time, the world beyond Japan took notice. Chefs in Paris and New York began pairing sake with fine dining, surprising diners who expected wine. Sushi restaurants introduced it abroad as both companion and teacher, showing that rice and rice wine belonged together in harmony. What had once been dismissed as rustic or old-fashioned was suddenly exotic, elegant, and worthy of curiosity. Exports grew, carrying bottles across oceans, each one a vessel of Japanese culture. In Japan itself, festivals embraced revival. Barrels were once again cracked open in Kagami Biraki, their lids split with wooden mallets as laughter-filled temple grounds. Younger generations, raised on beer and whiskey, rediscovered sake not as an obligation but as a choice. Breweries experimented with sparkling varieties, chilled styles, and pairings that appealed to modern tastes, proving that tradition could evolve without losing its core. Still, debates lingered. Some argued that sake was drifting too far from its roots, its new image shaped more for tourists than for the spirit of Shinto. Others insisted that survival required adaptation, that a drink which had endured famine and war could also embrace champagne flutes and international competitions. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. Today, sake occupies a curious position. In rural villages, it remains the heartbeat of seasonal festivals, poured from barrels under the open sky. In global cities, it is studied like fine wine, its tasting notes passed with solemn care. It is both everyday and ceremonial, humble and exalted, ancient and modern. The duality that defined it from the start, sacred and profane, ritual and indulgence, continues to shape its identity. What began as chewed rice in the mouths of maidens has become an ambassador across the world. And yet, in every sip, the same warmth lingers, connecting the drinker to a story older than any empire, older than any imported bottle. Step back from the lantern-lit streets of Edo, the steaming barrels of Niigata, and the crowded shrines where cups once lifted in unison. What remains is not just the story of a drink, but the story of a nation written in rice and water. Sake was never simply alcohol. It was medicine in the hands of priests, ritual on the lips of newlyweds, courage in the grip of soldiers, and laughter in the smoky corners of taverns. It endured war, poverty, and the seduction of foreign fashions, bending with history but refusing to vanish. The taste of sake carries contradictions. It is soft, yet strong, sacred yet ordinary, timeless yet ever-changing. To hold a cup is to hold centuries of devotion, labor, and belief. Every grain polished, every vat stirred, every barrel cracked open was a reminder that survival depends not only on resilience but on ritual, on the small acts that bind people to one another. In the warmth of sake, neighbors became kin, warriors became brothers, strangers became allies. Its survival tells us something larger. Traditions are not static relics but living currents. They shift, adapt, and reinvent themselves without ever fully breaking. Just as Japan balanced modernity with heritage, sake continues to walk that narrow path, flowing freely through shrines and global restaurants alike. It is at once local and universal, a cup of belonging for those who drink it in snowbound villages and for those who sip it oceans away, curious about its story. Perhaps that is sake's final gift. Not intoxication, not escape, but connection to ancestors, to community, to the quiet thread of history that runs through every shared cup. And as the steam rises, curling into winter air, the question lingers. When you raise the cup, are you tasting the past, or are you drinking the future?